A canyon in the deep wilderness, the dead of winter, stone walls rising 60 feet on both sides, ice-covered and absolute, the kind of place where cold stops being weather. Nothing moves, except, along one section of wall, hidden behind old ice, a crack, narrow enough to miss, easy enough to walk past, and from it, something impossible, warmth, steady, rising from deep inside the mountain. A figure moves towards it, young, a girl, alone in the canyon, everything she owns at her feet. She has been walking for 3 days. She is 18 years old. She is the last person anyone in the valley would expect to find what's hidden in this mountain. She reaches toward the crack. Her fingers disappear into warm air. She doesn't know yet that someone has been trying to find this place for 16 years. The trunk sat outside the door. That was all. No argument, no letter, no warning the night before, unless you counted the silence at supper, which Faye Aldrin had learned to count a long time ago. She had learned to read the silences in this house the way other people read weather. The closed-off quiet, the particular way Owen Jarvis set down his fork before he was finished eating, the way he looked at the window instead of at her. She had known this was coming. She just hadn't known it would be so quiet about it. The trunk held everything she owned, which wasn't much. 2 dresses, a work shirt and trousers she'd taken from the men's pile in the trading store 2 winters back because they were warmer. Her mother's Bible with the inscription faded to almost nothing on the first page, a small tin mirror, a blanket that had been her mother's and smelled less like her every year, a cookpot, a fire starter, her mother's jade pendant on a leather cord which she always wore but had taken off to clean the night before and hadn't yet put back on, and a cloth pouch containing $23. She'd been saving it. She hadn't known why. Now she did. Owen Jarvis was standing in the doorway. He didn't look mean. That was the strange part. He just looked finished, the way a man looked when he'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally decided to set it down. "You're old enough," he said. Not cruel, not angry, just done. Faye looked at him for a moment. She was 18 years old. She had lived in this house since she was 6. She had worked this farm since she was old enough to carry a bucket. She had cooked the meals and mended the fences and sat across from this man for 12 years, eating supper in silence. She had been waiting for him to see her. She understood now that he never would. "All right," she said. She lifted the trunk. He didn't offer to help. She didn't ask. The morning was cold. April in Heartland Valley meant frost still on the grass before noon, and the smell of mud underneath, trying to convince you spring was coming. Faye set the trunk on the porch and then went back inside for the one last thing, the pendant. She fastened it around her neck, felt the small weight of it settle at her collarbone. Her mother's. She had been told very little about her father, Daniel Aldrin. He had gone when she was 2. Something about money, something about the town. Her mother had never said it was his fault, which Faye had always found notable. Anna Aldrin had not been the kind of woman who withheld blame out of kindness. If she said nothing bad about someone, it was because she believed there was nothing bad to say. Owen Jarvis had come later. Faye had never called him father. He had never asked her to. She walked off the porch, didn't look back. Heartland Valley was small enough that leaving it took about 20 minutes on foot if you went straight down the main road. She didn't go straight. She went past the post office, past the trading store, past the little painted building that served as a church on Sundays and a meeting hall the rest of the week, past the well where 3 women were filling buckets, and 2 of them looked at her, and she looked back, and none of them said anything. She stopped at the last house before the northern edge of town. Mabel Cross's house had a green door. Anna had told her once that Mabel had painted it herself the day she moved in 30 years ago because she wanted something cheerful to look at every morning before the world had a chance to be difficult. Green, she'd said, the color of things that insist on living. Faye knocked. The door opened almost immediately, like Mabel had been watching through the window. She probably had. Mabel Cross was 65 years old, short, silver-haired, the kind of woman who had been through enough that the difficult things no longer surprised her, only the good things did. She looked at Faye, at the trunk on her shoulder, at the direction she'd been walking. She didn't ask. "Come in," she said. "I'll make tea." "I can't stay long," Faye said. "I know." She stepped aside anyway. The inside of Mabel's house was warm and smelled like dried herbs and wood smoke and something baking. It felt nothing like Owen Jarvis's house. It felt like the place you went when the world had been difficult and you needed something steady. Mabel put the kettle on. Faye stood in the kitchen holding her trunk because she didn't know if sitting down was the right thing to do when you were about to leave and not come back. "He finally did it," Mabel said. "This morning." Mabel set 2 cups on the table. "Sit down, Faye. The trunk's not going anywhere." Faye sat. Mabel sat across from her, looked at her in that way she had, the way that always made Faye feel like she was being read rather than looked at. "Where are you planning to go?" Mabel said. "North," Faye said, "toward the mountains." Mabel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother told me something before she died." The kettle began to whistle. Mabel got up and poured the tea and set it down and sat back down again and looked at the table instead of at Faye. She said, Mabel stopped, started again. She said, "If you ever had to leave Harglen, I should tell you to go north, toward the canyon country, past the second ridge." Faye looked at her. "Why there?" She didn't say why. She just said you'd understand when you got there. Mabel wrapped both hands around her cup. "I thought it was a strange thing to say. Your mother wasn't prone to mysteries. She was a practical woman." She was. But she said it twice. The first time and then again near the end when she was already failing, like she wanted to make sure I remembered. Mabel finally looked up. Her eyes were dry, but they had the quality of something that had been wet recently and was holding itself carefully. "I've been sitting on that for 2 years, wondering when to say it." "And now," Faye said, "and now you're leaving." Mabel looked at the trunk leaning against the wall. "So now I'm saying it." Faye drank the tea. It was good tea. The good kind, not the kind you made when you only had bark and old leaves and were pretending. She thought about her mother, about Anna Aldrin, who had carried a secret about the mountains north of Harglen and had told nobody except her best friend, and even then only in pieces and only at the end. She thought about her father, Daniel Aldrin, 16 years gone, accused of something and disappeared into the mountains and never came back. The name people said with a particular kind of quiet when they said it at all, the quiet that meant the subject was closed. Her mother had never used that quiet. "Did she ever talk to you about him?" Faye said. "About my father." Mabel was quiet for a long moment. "She didn't believe he did it," she said finally. "I know that much. Whatever they said he did, she didn't believe it. She kept saying it didn't fit, that it was too clean, that the story Harold Cutter told didn't match the man she knew." She paused, but there wasn't much she could do about it by then. He was already gone. Faye set down the cup, stood up. "Thank you for the tea," she said. Mabel stood too. She was shorter than Faye by half a head, but she looked at her like she wasn't. "Take care of yourself," she said. And Faye, she reached out and briefly gripped her arm, firm, certain. If you find something out there, if you find something that doesn't make sense, don't walk away from it. Faye picked up the trunk. I won't, she said, and she went. The road north out of Hargland Valley was good for about 6 miles. Packed earth, marks from wagon wheels and horse hooves, and foot traffic from the logging operations that worked the lower slopes in better weather. Then it became a track, then a suggestion of a path, then nothing at all. By the second day, she was navigating by the mountain shapes and by the way the snow lay on the north-facing slopes versus the south, and by the pool of the creek that ran down from the high country and turned into the same water that fed Hargland's wells. She followed it up. She was a practical girl. She had always been practical. She didn't cry about Owen Jarvis or the farm or the 12 years she'd spent working land that was never going to be hers. She didn't waste time on the anger of it, which was there solid and factual like a stone in her pocket. She just kept it and kept moving. At night, she made camp under rock overhangs and ate from the supplies she'd managed to bring. Dried beans, hardtack, a small wedge of salt pork, not enough for long, but enough for now. The mountains were serious in April. People who'd grown up in Hargland knew this. You didn't go into the high country before May unless you had a reason, and even then, you watched the sky. The cold here wasn't like town cold. Town cold was inconvenient. Mountain cold had opinions about you. It wanted you to go home, and when you didn't, it started making suggestions. By the third day, the creek had narrowed and the canyon had deepened. She was in the canyon country now. The walls rose on both sides of her, stone, dark gray and brown and rust-colored, streaked with old watermarks. Pine trees clung to ledges far above. The creek had frozen in the shallows, but still moved in the center, dark and fast and serious. The sound of it echoed off the stone walls. Faye had been here before. Once, when she was 12, some of the older boys from town had dared each other to go into the canyon country and come back, and she had gone with them because she didn't understand yet that invitations like that weren't really for her. She remembered the cliffs, the cold, the way sound moved differently here. She didn't remember it being beautiful. It was. Not in the easy way of meadows or mountain views, in the hard way, the way of things that didn't care whether you appreciated them or not, but were what they were regardless. She set up her third camp under a ledge of stone that jutted from the canyon wall about 8 feet up, enough shelter from the wind, enough rock overhead to block the worst of any snow. She built the fire small and kept it small because small fires lasted longer and announced themselves less. She slept badly. In the morning, the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. She felt it the moment she woke, the kind of cold that had moved in while she slept and rearranged everything. The fire was down to coals. Her breath made clouds. She pulled on her second pair of socks and the work shirt over her dress and spent several minutes just breathing and talking herself into standing up. The creek had frozen overnight, both edges solid, a thin rim of ice over the center movement. She ate, packed, began to move. She was looking for what exactly she didn't know. Her mother had said, canyon country, past the second ridge. She was past the second ridge. She was in the deepest part of the canyon now, where the walls were tallest and the light didn't reach the floor until well after noon. And that was when she felt it. She stopped, stood completely still. The canyon was frozen. The rocks were frozen. The air had been nothing but cold for 3 days. The consistent, numbing cold of high country in April, the kind that stopped being an event and became simply the air itself. But something had touched her face just now. Warm, not body warm, not fire warm, but warm, actual warm, a current of it, a thread of it drifting through the frozen air like something impossibly out of place. Faye stood and did not move for a full 10 seconds. Then she turned, slowly, the way you turned when you thought you'd heard your name called and weren't sure. The canyon wall to her left was rough stone, ice in the cracks, a long overhang of rock above. Nothing unusual, except she took one step and felt it again, warmer now, slightly, like moving toward a fireplace in a room you didn't know was warm. She turned again, more toward the wall, took another step. There, unmistakable, the warmth wasn't coming from above, wasn't coming from the air itself. It was coming from the wall, from somewhere inside the wall. A current, faint but absolutely real, brushing against her cheek like a hand. She moved toward it. The canyon wall was not uniform. Up close, what looked like solid stone was layers, shelves and cracks and old frost lines. Ice had built up in some places and left others clear. Hanging from one section of wall, a curtain of ice had formed over a deep shadow. Behind the ice, a crack. She pushed the ice aside. It came away in sheets older than she expected, thick with seasons, and there behind it was a vertical crack in the stone, not wide, the width of a large book on its spine, the width of a person turned sideways. The warmth flowing out of it was extraordinary, not hot, not fire, but steady, even, the temperature of a room with a low fire going and people in it and walls that kept the wind out. Faye put her hand into the crack. Her fingers disappeared into warmth. She looked at the crack, at its width, at the stone on either side of it. She took off the trunk and set it on the ground, turned sideways, and went in. The crack was tight for the first foot. Then it opened. She had to angle her shoulders, had to exhale and pull herself through a section that gripped at her coat, had to move carefully because the stone on both sides was ancient and certain and not going to negotiate. Then she was through, and she stopped because the space beyond wasn't a crack either. She was standing at the edge of a large chamber. Large. She turned around slowly, raising the lantern she'd lit on instinct before entering. The light reached the far wall and then kept trying to reach farther because the far wall wasn't where she'd expected it to be. The chamber was the size of a meeting house. No, larger. The ceiling was 8 feet high at the entrance and rose to 12 or 14 in the center, stone arching above her in a natural vault that someone had worked. She could see the marks of tools in some places, old marks weathered but deliberate. Someone had widened this. Someone had smoothed the floor and taken the worst of the loose rock away. Someone had installed beams, real cut timber beams, 2 of them bracing a section of ceiling where the rock had thinned. She walked forward, and the warmth wrapped around her like something that had been waiting. Not just warm, stable, even, coming from the stone itself, rising from the floor in a slow, steady heat that had nothing to do with fire. She crouched and put her palm flat on the stone floor and held it there, warm. From below, from deep below, she stood. There were shelves along the left wall, not natural shelves, not rock formations, wooden shelves, cut and fitted and pegged into the stone wall with iron hardware, 3 tiers of them running the full length of the chamber. Old, the wood had darkened with age and the air down here, but solid, still solid. A broken crate sat beneath one section, several intact containers on another, a lantern hanging from the beam above the entrance. She lit it. The oil in it impossible, but they're caught. The extra light showed her the rest of the chamber, a water channel. She almost missed it because it was set into the floor like a decorative border. Only it wasn't decorative. It was functional. A channel maybe 6 inches wide, cut into the stone floor with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, running along the left wall and disappearing through a slot at the far end. She listened. Water, moving water, underground somewhere below her, channeled into and through this space. She walked the full length of the main chamber. At the far end, she found the opening to a second chamber, smaller than the first. This one had a stone bench built along one wall, wide and flat and clearly intended for sleeping. Above the bench, iron hooks set into the stone at intervals, for hanging things, for making a space livable. She went back to the first chamber and then found the third opening. This one was low. She had to duck. Inside a kitchen. There was no other word for it. A raised stone platform against the back wall with a depression in it, a fire pit with an iron arm fitted above for hanging pots. More of the water channel here, running alongside the cook's surface and turning at the corner. The stone above the fire pit was blackened from use, old use, but the setup was so intentional, so considered, so obviously designed by someone who understood how to make a livable space out of rock and wood and iron that it stopped her where she stood. This wasn't a cave that someone had found and moved into. This was a home that someone had built. Fourth chamber. A workshop. She knew it was a workshop because of the workbench. 8 feet long, solid, bolted to the stone wall with hardware that must have taken weeks to bring up into the canyon country piece by piece. Tools still on the wall above it, hanging from iron hooks. A hand drill, several chisels, a draw knife, a small saw. Organized, chosen deliberately. The tools of someone who worked with wood and stone. Fifth chamber, smaller than the others. Storage. More sealed containers that she didn't open. A section of floor that showed marks where things had been stacked for a long time and recently moved. Sixth chamber. She almost missed the entrance because it was partially blocked by a fallen shelf, but she moved the shelf aside and ducked through, and her lantern lit up walls that were different from the others. This chamber had been fitted with shelves too, but these shelves held books, 10 or 12 books, a leather journal, maps rolled and stacked flat, a flat tin container she would open later and find held a supply of paper and a bottle of ink long dried to a solid mass. A chair, not a bench, a chair with a back and armrests built from wood that had been shaped and smoothed and joined properly. The chair of someone who intended to sit and read and think. She stood in the doorway of this chamber for a long time. The lantern light flickered over the spines of the books, over the maps, over the flat surface of the table beside the chair where the tin container sat, and beside it a ceramic cup that had held something and been set down carefully. The care of it. That was what got her. Everything in this place had been made with care, not just effort. Care. The difference between building something because you needed it and building something because you wanted it to be right. Every joint, every fitted stone, every deliberately placed hook. Someone had lived here and had made it livable, not just out of necessity, but out of love for the work itself. She picked up the leather journal from the shelf. It was heavy with use. The cover had darkened and softened with years of handling. She opened it. Pages of handwriting. Dense, precise, the writing of an engineer or a builder. Columns of measurements, sketches of the chamber layouts, notes about the water channel and the geothermal source, and between the technical entries, other entries, longer ones, more personal. She was trying to read by lantern light, and her hands were still cold, despite the warmth of the cave, and the words kept blurring on her, so she made herself slow down and read properly. November. Entry dated simply November, no year she could identify. Have begun widening the second chamber. The stone yields more easily than I expected at this depth, which tells me the geothermal activity is closer to the surface here than in other sections. The floor temperature in the main chamber holds between 58 and 62 degrees, even in the worst winter weather. I have been here through 2 winters now and can confirm the stability of it. This place is extraordinary. I do not think I fully understood what I had found in the first year. I understand it now. She turned forward in the journal. More entries. The building of the water channel, the installation of the wooden beams, a long technical passage about the natural ventilation created by the pressure difference between the crack entrance and a smaller gap at the far end of the 6th chamber that she hadn't found yet. Then she turned to near the back of the journal and found the place where the engineering entries stopped and the other entries began. These were different. She could tell before she read a single word just from the way the handwriting changed. Tighter, more deliberate. The writing of someone choosing each word with the care of someone who didn't know how much time they had. She sat down on the stone floor and read. I have been here 4 years now. The complex is complete, or as complete as one person working alone can make it. 7 chambers, water throughout, warmth throughout. If someone finds this place who needs it, it will serve them. She turned the page. I do not know if Anna received my last letter. The route I used has become uncertain. I have not had confirmation in several months. I think often about whether she believes what they said about me. I don't think she does, but I cannot know. She was always a person who decided things for herself, regardless of what anyone else told her, which was one of the reasons I loved her. I hope that quality has held. Faye's hand went still on the page. She looked at the word, Anna. She looked at the next line. I think about Faye. She would be 6 now, old enough to ask questions. I wonder what Anna tells her. I wonder if she tells her anything. I would not blame her for telling her nothing. There are things that are too complicated for a 6-year-old's questions, and perhaps some things remain too complicated even when the 6-year-old becomes something else. Faye sat on the floor of the 6th chamber of the underground complex in the canyon wall. The lantern light moved. Outside somewhere impossibly far, above and beyond the wind, was moving through the canyon, and the temperature had dropped another degree, and the world was cold and indifferent and going about its business. In here, it was 58 degrees, or 62, somewhere in that range, warm. She turned to the last entry in the journal. It was short. They are coming. Someone from the valley found the signs I left too recently to be explained away, and now Harold Cutter is coming with men, and I do not have time to do what I planned. The documents are where they should be, under the 3rd stone from the cook's surface in the kitchen chamber. I have sealed them properly. They will last. She read the next line. There is a letter in the tin on the reading table. I have been writing it for 2 years, and I still have not finished it. It is for Anna. If anyone finds this place before she does, I ask that you leave it for her, or find her and tell her where it is. Anna Aldrin, Harglen Valley. She will want it. The entry below that was a single line. I am sorry I ran out of time. D.A. Daniel Aldrin. Faye set the journal down on her knee. She looked at the reading table. There was the tin container she had noticed earlier with the dried ink and the paper. Beside it, held flat under a small stone to keep it from curling, a folded piece of paper that she had not noticed until now. She reached for it, unfolded it. The writing was different from the journal, not the engineer's precise hand, something looser, more personal, the writing of someone putting down words that cost something. My Anna, I have started this letter 100 times and stopped it as many. I don't know how to begin. I don't know if you are angry with me or grieving me, or if you have decided I was guilty after all and made peace with that. I know how stubborn you are. I know how you decide things. So I think you haven't decided I was guilty, because if you had, there would be a different quality to the silence between us, and I would feel it differently. Faye's throat did something. She pressed her lips together, kept reading. I want you to know what I built. Not just the chambers, not just the engineering. I want you to tell Faye when she is old enough that her father built something, that he made something out of the time he had available to him and the skills he had and the materials he could carry in piece by piece over 4 years. It is not the life I wanted to build for the two of you, but it is something. It is real. It will still be here when you find it. Come north when you can. Past the second ridge into the deep canyon country. Follow the warmth. You'll know it when you feel it. It doesn't end here. She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. The lantern burned steadily. The warmth of the complex moved around her, gentle and constant, and completely indifferent to what year it was or what had happened between that man writing that letter and this girl sitting on the stone floor reading it. Her father had built this. Her father had been here. Her father had written her name. Faye folded the letter carefully, set it beside the journal, stood up. She walked through the 6th chamber and back into the 5th and the 4th and the 3rd and the 2nd, and finally stood in the center of the main chamber where the ceiling arched above her and the water channel ran in its careful cut groove along the left wall. She put both palms flat against the floor. The warmth came up through the stone the way it had for however many thousands of years. The earth had been generating it steady and deep and entirely unbothered by human trouble. She sat down right there, in the center of the main chamber, in the place her father had built. Outside, the wind moved through the canyon, and the temperature dropped, and the creek froze another inch toward the center. The world was cold and difficult, and had been that way for her entire life. In here, it was warm. She was going to stay. She smelled the smoke herself before she saw him, which meant he was close, which meant she'd been so deep in the journal the past 3 days that she'd stopped paying attention to things outside. She set down the book she'd been cataloging, 3rd shelf, 6th chamber, a surveyor's manual from 1851 with handwritten margin notes that she'd been slowly working through, and moved to the main chamber entrance and listened. Footsteps outside the crack, heavy ones, someone not trying to be quiet because they didn't know there was anything to be quiet around. She picked up the wood-cutting hatchet she'd found in the workshop and held it in her right hand and pressed herself to the side of the crack entrance and waited. The ice scraped. A hand pushed through, then a shoulder, then a head with a gray beard and a knit cap, and an expression of profound confusion that shifted into profound alarm when he found himself looking at a young woman holding a hatchet. God above, he said. Who are you? Faye said. Amos Trent. He held both hands up, both empty. Trapper. I followed the smoke. Who are... He stopped, looked past her, at the main chamber, at the ceiling, at the lanterns. His mouth opened and closed. I'm Faye Aldrin. Amos Trent's eyes came back to her face. Something happened in them, something she couldn't read yet. Aldrin, he said. Yes. He stood just inside the crack, half in and half out, staring at the chamber around him with the look of a man whose understanding of what was physically possible had just been revised substantially. Anna's daughter, he said. Not a question. Faye lowered the hatchet an inch. You knew my mother. I knew your whole family, he said quietly. A long time ago. She let him in. He stood in the center of the main chamber and did what everyone did when they first entered. He turned around slowly. He looked up at the ceiling. He crouched and pressed his palm to the floor and held it there, and then stood up and turned around again like maybe the second look would make it smaller. It didn't. How long have you been here? He said. 8 days. 8 days. He walked to the water channel and looked at it, followed it with his eyes to where it disappeared through the slot in the wall. Did you build this? No. He looked at her. Someone built it before me, she said. Come look at the workshop. She walked him through the main chamber and the sleeping chamber and the kitchen and the workshop. She watched his face. He was good at keeping himself neutral, the way men who spent a lot of time alone in the mountains got good at it, the kind of careful that came from having nobody to perform for. But when she took him into the workshop and raised the lantern and the tools on the wall became visible, something shifted. He stood in front of the workbench for a long time, put his hand on it. Then he said very quietly, I know who built this. So do I, Faye said. His initials are in the journal. Amos turned to look at her. Show me, he said. She brought him the journal. He took it with hands that had a slight tremor in them that she didn't think was age. He opened it. He turned to the back where the personal entries were. He stood in the lamplight of the 6th chamber, in the chair her father's chair, and he read. She watched him. The trapper was 62 years old and had the face of a man who had made peace with most things. He was not making peace with something right now. How much do you know? He said finally. He was accused of something. He left. He came here. She paused. He wrote about my mother. He wrote about you too. Yes. Amos set the journal down on the reading table. He looked at the tin container, at the shelves, at the stacked maps. Daniel Aldrin, he said. He was the best builder in 3 counties, not just a builder, an engineer, could look at a hillside and tell you where the water ran underground and where it didn't, could design a structure that lasted twice as long as anything else in the valley. He stopped, and he was accused of taking money from the community fund, the money that was supposed to go to the new schoolhouse. Harold Cutter accused him. Harold Cutter was on the town council. Harold Cutter had the ear of everyone in Heartland Valley. Amos picked up the journal again and then set it back down. And when a man like that says, another man is a thief, people listen. Did you believe it? Amos looked at her. No, he said. I never believed it. Neither did your mother. But believing and proving are different things, and Daniel was already gone by the time anyone with sense started asking questions. Faye sat on the floor in the way she'd started doing, because it was the most natural posture in the 6th chamber, back against the bookshelf wall, legs crossed, lantern at her knee. He came here, she said. He must have. Amos gestured at the walls. But this, he shook his head. This wasn't built in weeks. This wasn't even built in months. The water channel alone would have taken, he did the math in his head, she could see him doing it. Years. This was years of work. He knew about this place before they accused him, Faye said. He'd been working on it for years already. He found the crack, found the warmth, started building. It was his, she searched for the word, his project, his private thing. Amos looked at her with a measuring expression. You figured that out yourself. From the journal. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've been alone in this place for 8 days, reading your father's journals." "Yes, and you're all right." She thought about it honestly. "I'm better than I was 9 days ago," she said. Amos sat down on the stone bench across from her and was quiet for a while. "Daniel wrote about Faye," he said, "in the journal. He thought about you." "I know. He didn't know if you were well, if Anna was well, if—" He stopped. "Anna passed, didn't she? 2 years back." "Yes." Something crossed his face. The specific grief of hearing news you'd somehow already suspected but hadn't confirmed. He pressed his mouth together and looked at the floor. "I'm sorry," he said. "She was a good woman, one of the best I knew." They sat in the warm chamber for a while without speaking. Outside, the canyon was cold and indifferent. In here, it was 58 degrees. "What happens when people find out I'm here?" Faye said. Amos looked up. "Some will come see for themselves," he said. "Some will send word. Some will wait to hear what others say before they decide what to think." He paused. "And Harold Cutter will say it's not what it looks like." "Why does it matter to Harold Cutter where I am?" Amos looked at her with the expression of a man choosing whether to say a hard thing or not. Then he said, "Because Daniel didn't run. He retreated. Those are different things. Running means you left everything behind. Retreating means you left something to come back to." He looked at the shelves, at the books, at the water channel. "And Harold Cutter has always known that if Daniel left evidence behind, it would be somewhere in these mountains." He stood. "I need to get back before dark," he said. "The weather's been strange. There's something coming." He stopped at the main chamber entrance and looked back at her. "Can I tell anyone?" Faye thought about it. "Tell Mabel Cross," she said. "She'll know what to do with it." He went. She heard him squeeze through the crack, heard the scrape of stone, heard his footsteps recede, and then the canyon returned to its winter silence, and she was alone again in the warm place her father had built. She thought about what Amos had said. Daniel didn't run. He retreated. She stood and walked to the kitchen chamber, stood in front of the cook's surface. She had counted the stones when she'd first explored this chamber, but she had been counting them as a surveyor counts them looking for the channel structure. She had not counted them as someone looking for a specific one. She counted now. First stone from the left edge of the cook's surface, second stone, third stone. She crouched. The stone looked the same as the others, gray-brown, fitted into the platform with the same careful joinery as everything else in this complex. You had to know to look. She pressed her fingers around the edge. It moved. Not much, a 1/4 inch, but it moved, which meant it wasn't mortared, which meant it had been designed to move. She got her fingernails under the edge and pulled. The stone came up. Beneath it, a hollow, maybe 8 inches deep, 8 inches square. The stone around it had been worked smooth, not left rough. Someone had spent time on this. Inside the hollow, an oilskin packet, wrapped in 3 layers, tied with a cord that had dried and tightened with age. She lifted it out, set it on the cook's surface, looked at it for a moment. Then she untied the cord and unwrapped the oilskin. Inside a sheaf of papers, folded together. The outer one had writing on it that she recognized as her father's engineering hand, except these weren't measurements. These were names and figures and dates. She sat down on the kitchen floor and spread them out, and she read. It took her most of an hour because she read slowly and carefully, going back over passages when she wasn't sure, making herself understand the whole before she tried to understand any piece. When she was done, she sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the papers spread out in front of her on the warm stone floor of the kitchen her father had built. The community fund for the new schoolhouse had been collected over 3 years. Everyone in Heartland Valley had contributed. Families who had very little had contributed anyway, because a schoolhouse was the kind of thing you contributed to. $223. At the time, it had been more money than most people in Heartland saw in 2 years. The money had disappeared, and Daniel Aldrin had been accused. What was in this packet was the bookkeeping that told the real story. Pages in Daniel's hand documenting what he had reconstructed from the public records before they were closed to him. Pages that showed in figures and dates and cross-reference receipts that the money had been moved in 3 installments into an account that was not the community account, an account that Harold Cutter controlled, an account that Harold Cutter had used over the following 2 years in pieces for the expansion of his trading store and the purchase of additional land on the south edge of the valley. Harold Cutter had taken the schoolhouse money, and then Harold Cutter had accused Daniel Aldrin of taking it. Faye held the papers for a long time. She thought about her mother, about Anna Aldrin going to her grave, knowing her husband hadn't done it, and knowing she couldn't prove it, and knowing her daughter would grow up with a father's name that had been dirtied on purpose. She thought about Owen Jarvis putting her trunk on the porch that morning. She thought about being 18 years old with $23 and nowhere to go. She wrapped the papers back in the oilskin, tied them, put them back in the hollow, replaced the stone. Then she went back to the main chamber and sat and let herself feel everything she'd been holding at a careful distance for the past 8 days. All of it. Her mother's death, her father's disappearance, the farm, Owen Jarvis's face when he told her she was old enough. She sat and felt it. And when it was done, she got up and made herself a meal and went to sleep. Word moved quickly in a small valley. Amos Trent told Mabel Cross. Mabel Cross told 2 people and asked them to tell 2 more. Within 3 days, the story had moved through Heartland like water through a crack. There's a girl in the canyon, Aldrin's girl. She found something in the rock, some kind of warm space. Extraordinary, they were saying. Impossible, some said. Must be a trick of the wind, others said. Harold Cutter said nonsense. He said it loudly, which Mabel Cross noticed, because Harold Cutter was a man who said things loudly when he wanted them to become the agreed-upon truth by volume, and the things he said loudly were never the things he actually believed. She had been watching Harold Cutter for 16 years. She told Amos this when he came by the following week. Amos listened. Then he said, "She found the documents." Mabel looked at him. "You think so?" She had the look, Amos said. "When I left, she was thinking about something she'd found, something that changed the shape of things." Mabel poured more tea. "Harold came to the trading post yesterday," she said. "He was asking Eustace what exactly people were saying about the girl in the canyon, not whether it was real, not asking about the shelter. He was asking what she'd found inside." She set down the pot. "He didn't ask whether she'd found anything. He asked what." They looked at each other. "He's known Daniel went into those mountains," Amos said. "He's known it for years. He's always known Daniel went somewhere. He just couldn't find the entrance. And now someone has. Someone who has every reason to look for what's inside." Harold appeared at the canyon the following day. He didn't go alone. He came with 2 men who worked for him at the trading post, and he walked up the creek bed with the air of a man on official business, which he had no official standing to conduct. But Harold Cutter had never required official standing for anything. He didn't find the entrance. He walked back and forth along the canyon wall for nearly an hour and found nothing, which was because Faye had replaced the ice curtain as best she could after Amos's visit, and because the crack was genuinely very hard to see, and because Harold was looking for what he expected to find rather than what was actually there. He left. She watched him go from the ledge above the crack entrance that she'd found she could reach by a narrow path up the canyon wall. She watched him go and she thought he's afraid, not angry, afraid. That was more useful information than she'd expected. The weather writer came a week later. Dex Werner was about 40 lean with the kind of permanent squint that came from spending too much time reading distant skies. He rode into Heartland Valley from the north on a horse that looked like it had been traveling hard, and he stopped at the trading post, and then at the general store, and then at the meeting hall, and people gathered because weather writers from the northern stations only came when they had something to say that wouldn't wait for a letter. He said it. One of the worst winter systems in 40 years, possibly more. He'd been watching it build from the northern stations for 3 weeks. The temperature drop that was coming, the duration of the storm, the amount of snow. He laid out the numbers in a flat voice, the voice of a man who had given hard news enough times that he'd learned not to soften it, because softening only delayed the part where people understood what he was saying. People in Heartland Valley understood. The valley flooded in hard winters. Roofs collapsed. Animals died. People sometimes died. 40 years ago, there had been a storm so bad that several families hadn't made it to spring. Amos rode directly to the canyon. He found Faye recalking the channel seam in the kitchen chamber with clay she'd found, packed in one of the sealed containers, which was so specifically the right material for the job that it took his breath away all over again that Daniel Aldrin had thought of everything. "You heard the weather writer," he said. She looked up from the seam. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She sat back on her heels and looked at the ceiling. "How many people in the valley," she said. "Hard winter, 40 or 50, who can't easily leave and shouldn't try." She looked at the main chamber, at the 7 connected spaces, their wooden shelves, their stone benches, their water supply, their steady warmth. "It holds more than that," she said. "I know," said Amos. "People will laugh," she said. "They'll say it's not real." Some of them have already been laughing. Faye went back to the channel seam. "Let them," she said. "They'll know when they need to." She was in the 4th chamber, the workshop, reorganizing the tool wall so the space could accommodate sleeping pallets if it came to that when she heard the sound. It was nothing much. A small sound, the sound of stone moving against stone, which happened naturally in the complex sometimes as the temperature differential between chambers shifted things by fractions of degrees, except this wasn't in the ceiling or the walls. It was coming from the kitchen. She set down the hammer she'd been using, moved through the chambers without the lantern. The complex was warm enough, and her eyes had adjusted to its ambient light over 2 weeks. She could navigate it now in near dark. The kitchen chamber had a faint glow, not her lantern. She'd left her lantern in the workshop. The glow was from outside, from the crack entrance, which meant it was coming from someone else's lantern, which meant someone had found the entrance. She pressed herself against the wall outside the kitchen chamber. Listen. A figure crouched over the cook's surface. She couldn't see the face because the lantern was positioned to illuminate the stones. The figure was moving systematically along the surface. First stone, second stone, third, the third stone, the hands pressing around the edges of the third stone. Faye stepped into the kitchen. The figure lurched upright and spun around. Not Harold Cutter, a younger man, one of the men who worked the trading post. She'd seen him around Heartland without ever learning his name. He was holding a short crowbar, and his face had gone white. "Get out," Faye said. "You were just leaving," she said. Now, before I decide what to do about this. He left fast, faster than Harold had the courtesy to when he'd come himself, scrambled through the crack with his crowbar and his lantern and the noise of someone who'd been told to search and hadn't found anything and was now going to have to explain that to the man who'd sent him. Faye waited until the footsteps faded. Then she went to the cook's surface. Third stone, she lifted it. The oilskin packet was still there. She took it out, held it, thought for a moment. Then she went back to the sixth chamber and took down the surveyor's manual from 1851 that she'd been working through, the one with the false bottom she'd discovered on the fourth day when the back cover had swung loose. She put the oilskin packet in the false bottom and replaced the cover and put the book back on the shelf. Then she went back to the kitchen and put a different packet, her roll of spare socks, and a note that read simply, "You are too late and also not very good at this," in the hollow under the third stone, and replaced it. She went back to the workshop, picked up the hammer, went back to reorganizing the tool wall because the storm was still coming regardless of Harold Cutter, and his crowbars in the tool wall needed to be finished, and there was a great deal of work still to do before 40 people who had laughed at the girl in the canyon showed up needing somewhere warm to sleep. The storm came like a wall. That was the only word for it. Not like weather building and darkening and announcing itself, not like the ordinary progression from clear to cloudy to threatening. A wall, white, moving down from the northern peaks with a speed that made Dex Werner's prediction feel conservative. Faye saw it first from the ledge above the crack entrance. She had climbed up there in the afternoon to check the sky the way she'd started doing every day because the sky was information, and information was the most useful thing she had. And when she turned north and saw the line of white moving down the mountain slopes, she stood very still for about 3 seconds, and then she climbed back down and went into the complex and started doing the thing she had been doing for the past 3 days in preparation for exactly this: moving sleeping materials out of storage and into the main chamber and the workshop, checking the water channel, filling every container she had with water, stacking firewood which she had been cutting for 2 weeks just inside the crack entrance where it would stay dry, taking inventory. She had room for more people than she had supplies for. That was the calculation she kept working. The complex would hold 30 people without difficulty, possibly 40 with some creativity in the sleeping arrangements. Feeding 30 people for a week was a different kind of problem. She would solve that when it became the problem. Amos arrived first. He came through the crack with a pack so large it barely fit through, and his face already creased with cold and the look of a man who had seen bad weather and knew this was going to be worse. "Started 2 hours ago in the upper valley," he said. "It's moving fast. How many coming? I sent word to 12 families who have the most exposure, plus whoever else decides when they see it coming." He shrugged out of his pack. "Mabel's coming. She said to tell you she was already packed." Of course she was. They worked together to finish the preparations. Amos knew how to set up a camp with the efficiency of someone who had been living in the backcountry for 40 years, which meant he wasted nothing and complained about nothing, and understood that speed was more important than perfection right now. The first family arrived an hour later, a woman with 2 children and a husband who had to turn sideways twice to get through the crack with a child on his back. They stumbled into the main chamber, and the woman stopped and looked around and said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then she put her hand on the wall. "It's warm," she said. "Yes," Faye said. "There's space in the second and third chambers. Put the children near the center where it's warmest. They moved. The husband came back through to make a second trip for their supplies. More people came. An elderly couple, the woman wrapped in so many blankets, she was approximately spherical. The man barely able to walk, both of them moving through the crack with the painful determination of people who knew they had no other option. A trapper, Faye didn't know, with 2 dogs who insisted on being in the same chamber as their owner and were eventually accommodated. A widow who had been crying and stopped when she felt the warmth, stopped mid-sob, and just stood there in the middle of the main chamber looking confused. By midday, there were 22 people in the complex. By afternoon, 24. Outside through the crack entrance, the sound of the storm was extraordinary. It wasn't howling. It was something lower and more consistent than howling. A sustained roar, the kind that came from the canyon, amplifying and channeling a wind that was itself enormous. Snow moved through the visible slit of the entrance crack like white smoke, horizontal, furious, finding the entrance and being deflected by the pressure of the warm air pushing outward. Inside, the lanterns barely flickered. The temperature in the main chamber sat at 58 degrees. Faye moved through the chambers, checking things, answering questions, helping people settle. She knew what she was doing had a word hosting, except hosting implied you had invited the guests, and she hadn't exactly invited anyone, and also the word felt too small for what was happening. 24 people in a space her father had built with his own hands over years, kept warm by the earth itself, sheltered from a storm that was already pulling at roofs in Hargland Valley. She moved and kept moving because motion was the best way she knew to keep the feeling at a manageable distance. The feeling was something between grief and gratitude, and an anger she wasn't ready to look at directly. Harold Cutter arrived at nightfall. She heard him before she saw him, heard the quality of a man who considered himself important, trying to negotiate a narrow crack entrance with his dignity intact, which turned out to be not physically possible. He came through in 2 stages, losing his hat in the process, and he straightened up inside the main chamber and looked around with the expression of someone whose face wasn't sure what to do. His wife was behind him, younger than him by 15 years, with the tight, controlled look of a woman who had learned to carry tension in her jaw. 2 children behind her, young, 7 and maybe 10. Harold looked at Faye. Faye looked at Harold. His jaw was set in a way that told her the note under the 3rd stone had been found and read. He knew she knew about the visit. He had decided to say nothing about it, which was, she supposed, the only decision available to him. The shelter is available to everyone, she said. Second chamber has some space. He didn't move for a moment. He was doing the thing she'd watched him do when Amos had described him from town, looking for the angle, the leverage, the thing that gave him more than he started with. There wasn't one. There was just a frozen canyon outside and a warm complex inside, and 24 people who needed the second chamber to stay viable. "Thank you," he said. The word came out like it cost him something. Good, Faye thought. Things should cost something. They moved into the second chamber. Mabel arrived an hour after Harold. She came through the crack with her bag and the composure of a 65-year-old woman who had decided something and was going to do it, regardless of weather or age or the fact that the entrance required her to turn sideways and briefly resemble a person being compressed. She straightened up, found Faye immediately, pressed her hand briefly to Faye's cheek in the way she had, the gesture that meant, "I see you and you're all right, and also, I have something important to say." "I brought Anna's diary." she said quietly. Faye looked at her. You've had it all this time, she said. She gave it to me when she knew she was failing, said keep it safe and give it to Faye when the time was right. Mabel looked around the main chamber at the 29 people settling in for what was going to be a very long night. I think the time is right. Faye looked at the second chamber, at Harold Cutter's back visible through the opening. Yes, she said, it is. She did not do it immediately. She let people settle, let the storm outside establish its full authority, which took until the middle of the first night, and was when it achieved it, something that even the adults stopped pretending wasn't frightening. The sound alone, the sustained, impossible sound of wind at that velocity of snow, so dense it was almost solid, hitting stone walls of a cold that existed out there with a purposeful quality, like it was looking for something. It was looking for them. It couldn't find them. In the middle of the second morning, when people had slept and eaten what they had brought, and the storm showed no signs of diminishing, Faye stood up in the main chamber. People were scattered across the space, some sleeping, some talking quietly, children playing a listless game near the water channel. Mabel was sitting against the far wall with her bag in her lap. Harold Cutter was in the kitchen chamber entrance, which gave a clear sight line into both. Faye said, "Can I have people's attention?" The chamber went quiet. She said, "This place was built by Daniel Aldrin. Most of you know that name." She paused. 16 years ago, he was accused of stealing the schoolhouse fund, and he left this valley because he had no way to prove he was innocent. She paused again. He didn't leave because he was guilty. He left because he'd been set up, and he knew it, and he couldn't stay and fight it without getting something worse than accusations. Harold's head turned. "That's a serious claim," he said. His voice was controlled, the voice he used when he wanted to be the largest thing in a room, making accusations against a community leader with no, "I have the evidence," Faye said. The chamber went absolutely silent. Harold's jaw set. "I found it," Faye said, "exactly where he left it." She looked at Mabel. Mabel reached into her bag. She pulled out a small diary, leather-covered, worn. She held it up and looked around the chamber at the faces of people she had known for 30 years, and then she opened it to a marked page. "Anna Aldrin was my closest friend for 30 years, she said. She kept this diary from the time she was married until the week she died. I'm going to read you what she wrote about the night Daniel left." She read. Her voice was steady, the steadiness of a woman who had been waiting to say something for a long time and was now saying it and did not intend to stop. Anna's voice through Mabel's voice filled the main chamber of the complex Daniel had built. She wrote about the night, about Daniel coming home and telling her what had happened and what Harold Cutter had done and how thoroughly he had arranged the evidence, about how Daniel had no witnesses and no alibi because he'd been working in the canyon on what he kept calling his project alone for 3 days, which was the same 3 days during which Harold Cutter had removed the money and constructed the paper trail that led to Daniel's name. She wrote about Daniel's decision. He's going north, into the mountains. He says there's a place there, that it's safe, that he's been building it for years, and it will hold, and when he can clear his name, he'll come back. I believe him, about the place and about coming back. What I don't know is how long it takes to clear a man's name when the man who destroyed it is also the man with the most influence in town. She wrote about what she knew Harold had done, the account, the amounts, the dates. Anna had done her own investigation quietly, over months going through the public records herself. After they reopened, finding the discrepancies that Daniel had found before her and documenting them in this diary in her careful school-taught hand. I cannot prove it, not in a way that would hold in any kind of formal hearing, not without someone willing to bring it forward, which requires someone with standing I don't have. So I write it here, for safekeeping, because someone should know. Mabel closed the diary. The chamber was very quiet. Faye reached into the surveyor's manual. The false back opened smoothly. She took out the oilskin packet, unwrapped it. She read the first page aloud, then the second, then the third, each one a piece of the accounting that Daniel had reconstructed before he fled, each one a figure or a date or a cross-reference receipt that put money in Harold Cutter's personal account during the same window it disappeared from the community fund. Harold Cutter did not speak. When she had finished, she set the papers down on the stone bench and looked at him. He was standing in the entrance to the kitchen chamber with his arms at his sides. His wife was behind him somewhere in the second chamber, and from the quality of the silence coming from that direction, it was clear she was listening. 16 years ago, Faye said, you took $223 from families in this valley who couldn't afford to give it. And when Daniel Aldrin found out, you accused him of doing it yourself so he would leave before he could bring it forward. Harold's face went through several expressions. None of them were guilt exactly. Guilt would have been simpler. They were the expressions of a man calculating whether he could still survive this, looking at 28 faces in a warm chamber that his victim had built, looking at the papers that his victim had left. He was going to go to the regional authority, Harold said. The chamber did not react to this for a moment. Then someone said, "What? Aldrin?" Harold's voice had changed, gone flatter, the calculation done. He found out, and he was going to take it to the regional authority, which meant I was going to lose everything, the store, the land, everything. Another silence. So you took the rest of it from him instead, Amos said from the back of the chamber. Harold said nothing. You took his name, Amos said, his marriage, his child, his whole life, because you were afraid of losing your store and your land. Harold Cutter stood in the entrance to the kitchen chamber and looked at the floor, and that was all he said. The storm lasted 7 days. 7 days in the complex, which meant 7 days of learning what 29 people with very little space and very little to do could become for each other, which turned out to be more than most of them expected. They organized themselves on the second day. Practical decisions, the way people made practical decisions when the alternative was chaos. Who would manage the water? Who would manage the fire? Who would handle the children? An older woman who had been a teacher organized reading lessons for the children using the books from the 6th chamber, which was how 3 children who hadn't been going to school had their first formal lessons in a library built by a man who'd been accused of stealing schoolhouse money, which had a quality to it that nobody in the complex missed. They ate communally. Whatever people had brought went into a common pool, and Mabel and another woman managed it with the expertise of people who had made limited resources last in difficult circumstances before. Nobody went hungry. Nobody ate too much. By the 4th day, there was a routine to it, the rhythms of eating and sleeping and the careful management of light and warmth that felt less like crisis and more like something else, like living. Harold Cutter ate communally with everyone else. His wife helped with the water on the 3rd day without being asked. His children played with the other children by the 4th day, and by the 5th were indistinguishable in the games from any other children in the complex. Harold himself was mostly quiet. He worked when work was needed and did not ask for anything specific and did not try to be in charge of anything. Faye watched this without being entirely sure what to do with it. She did not forgive him. She did not speak to him beyond what was necessary, but she also did not put him outside, which was not a noble instinct so much as a practical one. It was 40 below outside, and he had 2 children, and she noted that the not forgiving and the keeping him in from the cold could coexist without contradiction. On the 6th night, long after most of the chamber had settled to sleep, she sat in the 6th chamber with the lantern and her father's journal. She had been reading it since she arrived, going through it systematically, the way she did things when she wanted to understand them properly. The early entries were technical measurements, the progress of the construction notes about the geothermal properties of the stone. The later entries were more personal. He wrote about the mountains, about the way the light moved through the canyon at different times of year, about the animals he saw and the ones he heard but never saw, about what it was like to be alone for a very long time in a place that was extraordinary and to have nobody to tell about it. He wrote about missing them. Short entries, most of them. The entries of someone who had learned to measure feeling out carefully, not because the feeling wasn't large, but because writing it all down didn't help and sometimes made things harder. But some entries were longer. She found one from what she calculated was about 4 years after he'd left. Faye will be 6. I think about what it is to be 6. I remember being 6. Everything is very large and very certain when you are 6. The world is organized in a particular way, and you are learning where you fit in it. I hope she is learning that she fits in it well. She has Anna's sense. She will be stubborn, I think. Anna is stubborn in the best way, not inflexible but certain. Certain of what matters and certain that what matters is worth the cost. I hope Faye got that too. She closed the journal, sat for a while, then she went to sleep. The 7th day the storm wound down, not all at once. A storm like that didn't end so much as gradually relinquish. The roaring diminished to a howling, and the howling diminished to a steady wind, and the steady wind became gusts, and the gusts became intermittent, and on the morning of the 8th day, Faye woke before anyone else and walked to the crack entrance and pressed her face to it. Silence, not the silence of the storm, taking a breath. Actual silence. She squeezed through. Outside, the canyon was transformed. Snow had filled it to a depth that changed the proportions of everything. The creek invisible under drifts that came halfway up the walls. In places, the pine trees above reduced to white shapes. The sky was the particular hard blue that came after serious weather, clear, cold, the sun not yet above the canyon walls, but the light already starting at the top. The air was still. The warmth behind her at the crack entrance drifted out gently, the same ribbon of warmth she had followed 20-some days ago. She stood in the snow and looked at the canyon, and then she looked north, at the figure coming. She did not understand at first that it was a figure, a shape she thought, a shadow, something moving between the canyon walls in the direction of the deeper mountain country, moving at the careful pace of someone navigating deep snow on foot. She stood still. The figure came closer. A man, older. She could see that now. A coat that had been through many winters. A pack, moving with the measured efficiency of someone who had been moving through this landscape for years and understood it in the specific way of long acquaintance rather than any kind of mastery. He was coming toward the complex, toward the crack entrance. Faye's heart was doing something she didn't have a word for, not racing, something more careful, something more terrified of being wrong. The man came closer. He stopped about 30 feet away. He had a gray beard, dark eyes she could see now. the kind of face that had weathered into itself over time and was still underneath the weathering, a specific face, a face with a specific shape to the jaw and a specific angle to the brow. She had her mother's nose. She had apparently her father's jaw. He was looking at the crack entrance, then at the footprints in the snow, then at her. He was trying to understand what he was looking at. I smelled smoke, he said, from the canyon 3 days before the storm. Then the storm hit and I couldn't move. He stopped. He was looking at her with an intensity that was not threatening and was not casual. Someone found the entrance. Yes, Faye said. You, he said it carefully, like the word was a handle on something breakable. Me. He looked at the crack, at the faint warmth visible in the cold air at its edges. I built that, he said. I know, she said. I read the journal. He looked at her again. The look went deeper this time. The journal, he said. You read. He stopped. He was doing the calculation. The age, the face, the name. What is your name? She said, Faye Aldrin. The canyon held them both. The man in front of her was 45 years old. He had been 45 years old for several weeks now, out here in the mountains, and nobody had known. He had been in these mountains for 16 years, and the world had moved on without him, and he had moved on without it, and they were standing now 6 feet apart in snow that came to his knees and hers. His face was doing something complicated, something that was many things at once. Faye, he said. Just that. Daniel Aldrin, she said. He pressed his lips together. The precise expression she had seen in her own mirror, the expression she made when she was trying to hold something together that wanted very much to come apart. Your mother, he said. Is she? He stopped, started again. Did she come with you? Is she? And there it was. The question she had known was coming. The question she had been carrying toward this moment since the day Amos Trent told her whose journal she was holding. Faye looked at her father. She died 2 years ago, she said. She was sick for a while. She wasn't alone when she went. Mabel was there. Daniel Aldrin stood in the snow. He stood very still for a very long time. The blue sky was coming up fully now, the sun reaching the top of the canyon walls and starting its slow descent. The snow had that quality it got after a major storm, a hard, compressed silence, like the world had said everything it needed to say and was now waiting. He sat down, right where he was standing, in the snow, in the canyon, outside the place he had built, and he sat down in it and put both hands on his knees and looked at nothing. Faye stood in the snow. She didn't go to him yet. She wasn't sure if that was right. She wasn't sure what was right. She had been imagining this moment since she read the first page of his journal, and she had imagined it many ways, and none of them had been quite like this. In none of them had she been the one carrying news he didn't have yet. Behind her, she heard the crack. Mabel Cross came through. She always had the worst timing and the best timing simultaneously. Mabel Cross. She came through the crack and straightened up and looked at Faye and then looked at the man sitting in the snow, and she stood there for a moment. Her face, the geography of a face that had known this man 20 years ago and was now receiving him back from the world he had been in. She walked toward him through the snow. He looked up when she got close. Mabel, he said. Daniel, she said. She sat down in the snow next to him, which was Faye thought exactly the right thing to do. She left them there for a few minutes. She went back through the crack and moved through the chambers quietly, not waking anyone. She went to the 6th chamber and took down the surveyor's manual and opened the false back and took out the oilskin packet. She held it for a moment. Then she went back through the crack and into the snow. Amos Trent had come out while she was inside. He was standing a little apart in the way he stood, the way of a man who understood when proximity was not required, but presence was. Daniel was still sitting in the snow. Mabel was beside him. They were not talking. They were sitting in the way that people sat who had known each other a long time and understood that some moments didn't require talking. Faye crossed the snow toward them. She crouched down in front of her father. She held out the oilskin packet. He looked at it, then at her. "It's the evidence," she said. "Everything you collected before you left. The accounting, the dates, the cross-reference receipts." She paused. "Harold Cutter is inside. He's been inside for 7 days with 28 other people who heard Mabel read Anna's diary aloud and then heard me read these papers." She paused again. He didn't deny it. Daniel Aldrin looked at the packet in her hands. He did not take it yet. He said, "How did you find the entrance?" "I followed the warmth," she said, "the air coming through the crack. It was the only thing that was wrong with the cold, so I followed it." He looked at her for a long moment. "She said you'd be stubborn," he said. "Your mother. She said you'd notice the things other people walk past." "She was right," Faye said. He took the packet from her hands. He held it carefully, the way you held something that had cost a great deal and was now finally in the right place. 16 years, he said. "Yes." He looked at the canyon, at the complex entrance, at the crack in the stone wall that was barely visible, behind which 28 people were sleeping in the warmth he had channeled out of the earth itself. "She never believed it," he said. "Anna." "No," Mabel said from beside him. "She never did." He sat in the snow for another minute. Then he stood. He was taller than Faye had expected, or maybe she had expected him to be smaller after all that time in the mountains. But he was just his actual height, which was tall, and he stood in the snow and looked at the canyon and breathed the cold air. He looked at Faye. "Show me what you've done to it," he said, not a question, not hesitant, the voice of an engineer being shown a project, and underneath it, quieter, the voice of a father being given something he had not known was possible. Faye turned toward the crack, and she showed him. She led him through the main chamber and the sleeping chamber and the kitchen, where he stopped and looked at the water channel for a long moment with his hand on the seam she had recaulked and said nothing. She led him to the workshop where the tools were reorganized and the sleeping pallets she had set up sat in rows, to the storage chamber, to the 6th chamber with his books and his chair and his reading table and the tin container and the letter she had not moved. He stood in the doorway of the 6th chamber. The letter was still there. She had left it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he stepped inside and picked it up. He looked at it in his hands. "I was going to burn this before I left," he said. "The night I left. I thought it was foolish, writing a letter you couldn't send to a person who might never find the place." He turned it over. "I couldn't do it, so I left it." "I'm glad you did," Faye said. He set it back down on the table, and then 28 people began to wake in the chambers around them, and children's voices started, and the smell of the water heating for morning tea drifted through the passage, and the complex filled with the sounds of people coming back to themselves after the long, strange night of a storm that had tried to take them and failed. Daniel Aldrin stood in the chamber he had built and listened to those sounds, and something in his face went very still, then very open, the way a face looked when it finally understood that something done with one's own hands and one's own stubbornness had mattered in a way that couldn't have been planned for. She left him there. She went back through the chambers to the main room where people were waking and moving and asking about the weather outside. She climbed through the crack. The canyon in the morning light was extraordinary. Snow on every surface. The sky a hard clear blue above the canyon walls. The sun coming down the east face and hitting the snow and making everything bright. The cold had changed, not gone, not soft, but changed the way cold changed after a storm like that to something cleaner and less hostile, the kind of cold that was just winter, being itself rather than winter trying to make a point. The warmth behind her at the crack entrance drifted out steadily, same as always, the same warmth that had stopped her in her tracks 20-some days ago, the same warmth that her father had found years before her and followed into the rock and turned into something that outlasted his absence and his accusers and the 16 years between then and this morning. She stood in the canyon and looked north and thought he followed the warmth too, not the geothermal kind, the other kind, the kind that made you build something extraordinary in a hidden place with nobody watching, because you believed, without being able to prove it, that it would matter someday to someone who needed it. She put her hands in her pockets. The cold on her face was just cold. The warmth at her back was what it always was. She watched the morning come into the canyon, and she stayed there, and she let it.